The mid to late 1980s was a mixed bag of various different things happening in relation to the Cold War and in relation to Ronald Reagan's presidency itself. You see, in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the premier of the Soviet Union. And it became obvious at first, even though Ronald Reagan was somewhat skeptical, it became obvious that Mikhail Gorbachev was sincere in his efforts to maybe redirect the Soviet Union's economy, which had been struggling at that time. And then also to perhaps improve relations not only with the United States, but with the world at large. And so Gorbachev drove various different Soviet political movements. Two most notable are glasnost, this sort of openness and dismantling of oppressive mechanisms that had been part of Soviet life since its Russian Revolution. And the second one, perestroika. That's a reform, basically a reformation of the Soviet economy, which had been, like I said, really struggling. So under perestroika, the Soviet population might actually be able to obtain private ownership and property. That's virtually unheard of in a communist country. Okay? So, profit motive, things along those lines, that could potentially be negotiated with perestroika. So, you have more of a transparency and more openness. And then, of course, you have a possibility for perestroika, an actual capitalist type of movement. So, with that, Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost and perestroika, he also combined a renewed sense of Soviet foreign policy that would be more open than prior regimes. Okay. Part of the reason why Gorbachev was open to perestroika and glasnost was because the Soviet Union had been really struggling, economically speaking, in the 1980s, and it struggled to really sustain many of its commitments around the world. And so, particularly in Eastern Europe, many of the Eastern Bloc countries like Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Bulgaria, they were really struggling. And by 1989, every single one of those Eastern Bloc countries that I had just mentioned declared independence from their Soviet puppethood. And they transformed or overthrew their governments to being non communist or otherwise outright anti communist. A complete 180. And of course, the United States is like, yes, yes. Ronald Reagan's like, Mr. Gorbachev, yes. So so there are some great things going on in 1989 with the Cold War. Now, of course, the Soviets split Berlin in two with the Berlin Wall, East Berlin separating West Berlin, which became a hyper signal of communism. In prior videos, I've talked about how Donald Trump has designs on building a wall between the United States and its Mexican border, and how some people make comparisons about how that's reminiscent of the Berlin Wall. I disagree with that. I don't agree with the wall being built, but I disagree with the comparison. Largely because the wall that is proposed to be built is meant to keep people who don't legally have a right to be here out. Okay? If you're going to come to the United States, come through an official port of entry or other factors that are officially and legally recognized. Crossing an arbitrary border at a random point, that's not legal. So, from that standpoint, building a wall is meant to deter that. You're meant to keep people out who don't have a right to be here. The Berlin Wall was created to keep people from leaving. You cannot leave an oppressive situation. You cannot leave an oppressive government that is known for bitter reprisals if you don't follow suit. That's a massive difference. One, to keep people out who shouldn't be there, and the other one to keep you from leaving. You cannot leave to improve your situation. That's what the Berlin Wall was. That's a massive distinction. So, again, I have very, very mixed feelings about any sort of border wall, but I definitely don't see it the same way as the Berlin Wall. Okay. Otherwise, though, the Berlin Wall had stood for 40 years, separating East and West Berlin. And with the independence movements and fall of communist governments in so many different Eastern European countries, East Germany being one of them, uh, it became time for one of the most dramatic events in entire Cold War history. And that is the Berlin Wall being torn down in 1989. It would also be a symbol for East and West Germany to unify as a democratic Germany. West Germany wins. Okay? So that is a massive victory for pro-democratic regimes all across the world. That's a massive victory for the United States. Okay? The Soviet Union is struggling. They are open to the idea of expanding their economy, even putting in many different capitalist features. Former Soviet Eastern Bloc puppet states are declaring independence and installing anti-communist governments. That's perfect if you ask America. Okay, things are looking on the up and up. Let's go to China. China, since the Mao Red regime in the late 40s had been a communist country, it wasn't until the 70s that the United States would formally establish diplomatic ties with China. But you do have a growing sentiment in China that perhaps maybe there's a greater calling for democratization in China. The Chiang Kai-shek regime, which had been around before Communist China had its revolution, was obviously non-communist, but they were ineffective because they were brutalists. They were, in many different ways, brutal unto their people. You're not going to gain favor that way. Well, communism has its own brutality. Okay? So, in Beijing, in June of 1989, many different pro-democracy protesters gathered around Tiananmen Square, which is the major park in Beijing, to demonstrate their desire for a pro-democratic China. What did the Chinese government do? Did they capitulate and explore new ideas, maybe to democratize? Or did they brutally assault and crush the democratic movement with hardline power and kill some of the demonstrators? If you guessed the latter, you're right. The Chinese military came into Tiananmen Square with tanks and killed several of the protesters. There's one famous media scene where a protester is standing directly in front of a military tank. What does the tank do? It ran over the protester on TV. You can find footage of the guy standing in front of the tank. You don't see what actually happens for obvious reasons. The tank ran him over. Welcome to China. Okay? China eventually would modernize its economy and adopt some Western capitalist principles. Even though it is a brutal regime that is very, very tight-lipped and controlled, obviously they have propaganda machines, most notably of which is centered around this whole coronavirus thing, trying to blame the United States for the coronavirus. Okay, sure, whatever. They have westernized much of their economy because they realize you kind of need capitalist ideas to have true economic growth, but I digress. China had been the exception to staving off democratization all across the world. So you had other places like South Africa, for example, where civil rights leader Nelson Mandela had been imprisoned for the better part of 27 years. They were on the verge of collapse, and a South African revolution, an end of apartheid, now came to play. Apartheid basically is the legalized form of discrimination unto black people. So, kind of like how there was the Jim Crow era laws and disenfranchisement of black voters and Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal policy. Think about all that and then multiply it. That's how bad apartheid was. That's what the word apartheid means. Okay? So, an end to apartheid with the symbolic freeing of Nelson Mandela now comes to South Africa. And now you have a truly free and democratic South Africa. And in 1994, they would hold elections. And that year, Nelson Mandela would become the first black president in South Africa. Okay? Let's go to the Soviet Union itself. We'd seen perestroika, we'd seen glasnost. The Gorbachev era had entered in an era with weak economy, struggling communist views, a struggling communist party, and a country that was on the verge of collapse. So, there had been a coup in the summer of 1991 by hardline Soviet leaders that, even though it was unsuccessful, it would start the unraveling of communist power in China. By the end of August, many of the various different republics of the Soviet Union had declared independence. And then later that year, the Soviet Union would collapse itself. The Soviet Union would cease to exist. Nowadays, you have Russia, which had been the biggest component of the Soviet Union itself, now a bunch of former Russian republics. That essentially confirmed the end of the Cold War. Many people say it was the fall of the Berlin Wall that was the real reason, the real cause, the official end. People also say it may be the actual end of the Soviet Union itself. Okay. Immediately, the Soviet Union, which had had troops in Afghanistan for 8 years from the late 70s to the mid to late 1980s, had really collapsed under its own weight. You see, in Afghanistan, the United States was able to exact retribution onto the Soviets for what they did to provide North Vietnam with arms and weapons to fight against American troops in Vietnam. Many, many, many American men lost their lives in Vietnam. And a large part of it was because of Soviet help and advisement and money and weapons. Heck, the North Vietnamese rifle, the semi-automatic rifle of choice that many Viet Cong fighters also had, was the AK-47, a Kalashnikov. That's a Russian rifle. Okay? The United States returned the favor. And we would fund many of the Mujahideen fighters against Soviet official troops, including one particular defense mechanism called a Stinger missile. That is a shoulder-mounted missile that can lock onto a target, like a Soviet helicopter, and blow it out of the sky. Stinger missiles changed Afghanistan and the Soviet involvement there. And we turned the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan into their Vietnam. They pulled out in disgrace in 1988. And then 3 years later, their entire country fell apart. Bye-bye communism. Okay? So, eventually, Russia / Soviet Union would have to agree to various different things to change its nuclear policy. And it did. Okay? Otherwise, though, the Reagan era was pot-marked with other different things. Outside of the positive economic benefits and the fall of communism, we won the Cold War. The Iran-Contra affair kind of stole some of Reagan's thunder. The United States, under the Iran-Contra affair, was selling arms and munitions to Iran and using the money from those proceeds to fund rebel fighters in Central America fighting against pro-communist, anti-American regimes. So, you're feeding one demon to help pay for another. And even though Ronald Reagan was never proven to have had any specific involvement, his political history and his presidency took a little bit of a tarnish because of it. Okay, so that was the Iran-Contra. Otherwise, though, the United States, we won the Cold War. Berlin Wall is coming down. We're doing it.